So this talk will be a little bit different than probably most of the ones today. I will be discussing technology, but more broadly, I will be discussing the technology industry, how it intersects with the world that we live in 2017. And it's also a personal story of my life and my year, and how I used my position as a technologist to try to make change in the world, and some of the fallout that has happened from that. Some of the topics in this talk are going to be very heavy. There's going to be imagery, video, and discussions that are going to be unpleasant to see. And I don't blame you if you want to leave during it, because to be frank, if I could have left the last 2.5 months of my life, I would have. But I have to tell this story, and part of telling the story means showing the real violent images of what we have gone through and how that relates to our industry in general. So before I was a data scientist, I was actually an engineer. I worked in medical devices. I worked in aerospace. And one of the things that we do in those industries is we have to deal with quite a bit of regulation in how we write software and how we design machines, components, programs, operating systems, algorithms. And one case that always struck me as very interesting is the case of Therac 25. Therac 25 was an electron beam radiation machine built in the 1970s. It was programmed with PDP-11 assembly code. And over the course of a couple of, I'd say a decade and a half, there were a number of incidents where patients received a dose of radiation that was orders of magnitude stronger than what they were prescribed. 6 patients overall were affected by this, and 4 of them died from their injuries. When looking into the issue, it was found that a software bug caused this problem. This is one of the first cases of a software bug killing people in just sort of real-world, real-life scenarios. And in the wake of the investigations, and this took many years to figure out what happened because it wasn't a very easy software bug to find. In order to make it happen, you had to press a certain key sequence with a very specific timing at a very specific stage of the process. So it was very difficult to replicate. It was very nearly a non-deterministic bug. And when they found out what happened, software regulations for medical devices were created. And I found this fascinating. And in my career doing medical device development, which I no longer do, I got very involved in the process of how do you certify medical devices? How do you deal with different classes of medical devices? And so when the election happened in the United States last year, I was very interested in the voting machines that I used to vote for president, for other representatives in my government. And I decided a few weeks after the election, right when we were in the height of the recount drama and wondering how what just happened actually happened, I decided to look and see what are the regulatory processes for voting machines. Are there any? And what I found was actually quite terrifying. And this is what kind of kicked off my path to being a technological activist. And it started with a tweet, and no good things ever start with a tweet. But I'm going to read part of one of the test reports for one of these voting machines. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the important parts. As the source code is reviewed, a SHA-256 hash value will be created for each source code file. The source code team will then conduct automated source code review using checkstyle. That's it. They've partially re-implemented Git, and then they run a linter. And that's it. So there is no review of the security. There is no review of the vote handling pathways. There's no review that your actual vote gets recorded, that it gets recorded properly. And they don't actually test for this. When they test these machines, most of the testing that is done is hardware related. Is it shock protected? Does it work in high humidity? What if the paper is creased? What if there's a paper jam? That kind of thing. And that's all very important. But they only run about 100 ballots through each machine. So you could very easily, if you were a developer, sneak in some code that said, after 1,000 votes, change every 3rd vote to candidate X. And this would not get caught. What's even more concerning is when you look at what the process by which they go through the review, they only review source code comments. And because there actually had failures at line length in the linting process, not during the development cycle, but during the very expensive review procedure, it tells me that these companies are not using proper version control techniques. Because a line length check would be, you could implement that naively with 3 lines of Python and trivially implement that into a Jenkins build or something like that. They're not doing that, which means if they're not doing that, it is super easy for any skilled developer to put in malicious code. So just to give you an example of the kind of code that these voting machines run, this is one voting machine, one model. These are the languages that it uses. And C and C++, that makes sense. Like, there's embedded stuff, and C++ has been around for a while. Everything has some C++, so that's fine. And then there's Java and C#. Don't really know why you need both of those. And then there's COBOL and VB. And then we're going to throw some SQL in there for good measure. Really hoping that there's a COBOL to SQL or COBOL to Postgres adapter. So when going through this, I had this realization that as a technologist, I had not just the ability to, but a duty to preserve democracy, because our world is becoming increasingly technical. And if we don't have skilled people holding our devices and their manufacturers and their users accountable for what they are doing, then we are failing as a society. But there's a problem. And the problem is that I did this in November of 2016 after the US presidential election. And earlier in that year, there was a little bit of a brouhaha that you might have heard of in the United States in the tech industry, where a known white supremacist was invited to speak at a conference. And people tried to shut this down. The conference was Lambda-Conf. And it became quite controversial. And a petition went around, and I was one of the many signatories of that petition. Punitively, because the tech industry has quite a few white supremacists inside of it, a site was created to generate a list of all the people who dared speak out against this. And this was very explicitly created as an industry hit list, a list to target individuals, to prevent them from gaining employment, to specifically call them out, to dox them, and to harass them. And I was one of the people on this list. And I was a little bit proud of this. Like, when you actually get on a list like this, you're like, all right, I'm doing the right thing. But the problem is that in looking at this list, it was compiled with the guidance of Milo Yiannopoulos. And Milo, or Milo, I'm not really sure how to pronounce his name, and I don't really care that much, worked for Steve Bannon, who at the time was the president or CEO of Breitbart, a media organization in the United States that is known for peddling a lot of hate stories and conspiracy theories. And he was also named as the chief strategist of the President of the United States. So here I am having this realization that I'm on a hit list that is 2 handshakes away from the desk of the President of the United States. And now I'm openly questioning whether the election was legitimate, and it's making international news. So what do you do when you've got that situation? So my answer was I fled the country. I went to Prague. Prague is a lovely city. And I lived there for as long as I could. And was there watching as my country implemented horrific policies. A ban on Muslims from entering the country. There was talk of anti-LGBT discrimination that may have led to my passport being revoked. This was a terrifying thing to watch. I watched friends of mine get arrested in Washington, D.C. They now face 70 years in prison because they had the temerity to be on the same street block as some people who broke 5 windows. While I was in Prague, I decided that I needed to do more with my activism, and I decided to root myself in the history of the place. And I spent a lot of time at the Jan Palach Memorial. Jan Palach was a student who in 1969, in January, self-immolated at the steps of the National Museum in Prague to protest the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia at the time. This was a very dramatic moment, and it struck me because I had to think about what it would be like to be in a system so oppressive, to be in a situation so dire, that the way to use your voice would be to literally kill yourself, to stop existing. And so that rooted my activism because I never wanted to get to that point. So the question was, how do I focus my activism to make real change? How do I use my privilege as a technologist to make change in the world? I was able to do something when I talked about the voting machines. And it made waves, but it ultimately didn't do anything because nobody has gone and fixed it yet. We still don't have paper ballots. We still don't have random audit procedures. We still have private companies writing closed-source voting machine software. How do we fix that? Well, I didn't have the energy to create a movement to change that. But what I did have is a blue check mark and a Twitter profile. And so I would speak out against industry sexism and racism and try to stay in my lane. And when the James Damore memo came out, I might have crossed a little bit of a boundary, but it actually made a difference because here was somebody saying that they have had enough of the sexism and bigotry in the industry that they would be willing to go to jail to try to stop it from happening. And of course, when I wrote this, I managed to get my very own Breitbart headline. Steve Bannon has a recurring theme in this story. And so this wasn't, exactly the best timing. But what it really led me to draw my attention to was, what does activism look like when it is focused and effective? Where can an ordinary person like me best make a difference? And so the answer to that is to act locally. There are always problems in our communities that need more voices, need more support, need more money, need more creativity, or just need somebody to show up. And so I said, all right, well, once I get back from Prague, I'm going to get more involved in local activism. This whole, kicking the Oval Office and annoying it and then fleeing the country thing is really not my strong suit. Let's stay a little bit more low-key. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. What's the worst that can happen? And it was great for a minute. We had a couple of rallies to talk about some things, and we have some issues in that city that are a little bit more mundane than what's been on the news, and I really wanted to root myself in those and make a difference there. But Charlottesville had other plans. Because somebody who lives in Charlottesville by the name of Jason Kessler decided that it was going to be the perfect place to hold a rally, to unite the right. It was called Unite the Right. And he somehow managed to bring all of these big names together. And what's interesting about all of these people is these are not speakers in the traditional mold of political thought. These are people who have built their presence online, using the same systems, the same techniques, the same platforms that we have seen in the industry for quite some time. Richard Spencer, 65,000 Twitter followers. Baked Alaska, 170,000 Twitter followers. 1 million YouTube subscribers. These are people whose entire movement has been built on the very platforms that we create, that we optimize, that we plan around, that we implement as features. So, as technologists, we are complicit in this. How do we make that not happen? So this was really interesting to me because here it was, and if you look at this poster, and it may be hard to see, but these are memes that are up there. The Pepe meme that is common among right-wing trolls online. That's how this was being advertised. This was an evolution of what we had been witnessing for the past 5 years with Gamergate. And now it was going to come and it was going to finally manifest itself in physical space. And it was going to do it half a mile from where I live. And it manifested. And this was the night of August 11th at the University of Virginia. 300 to 350 people carrying torches marched through the University of Virginia grounds. They chanted Nazi slogans. They chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And when they got to their destination, the statue of Thomas Jefferson out front of UVA's famous rotunda, they found a small group of counter-protesters, students, 19, 20 years old, and some community members, maybe about 30 people tops. I was one of them. And what they did was they marched down the steps, and they immediately surrounded us with torches, with weapons. And as they surrounded us, they got closer and closer and closer. I'm going to play what it sounded like. As they encroached upon us, they yelled things like, "Die, commie." They were chanting, "White Lives Matter," in response to our Black Lives Matter chant. And then they maced us, and they poured fuel on us, and then they started swinging lit torches at us. And when they failed to light us on fire, they decided to beat us with those torches. The next day was the rally proper. This is an image from that day. These men are not soldiers, and if you're not from the United States, maybe you don't have a really strong grasp of what gun culture is like in the United States. These are private citizens. They're not police. They're not National Guard. These are people who just live in the area and decided to come loaded to bear with assault rifles, handguns, who knows what. And in the resistance to this rally, we had to deal with 6 different militias, 7 different armed police forces. And that doesn't even count the Nazis that were carrying shields and clubs and flagpoles. What was interesting about this rally was that it was organized entirely online. And so if you have spent time online, you know that the trolling is egregious, sometimes ridiculous, and it's out there. And it's easy to dismiss. It's easy to think, this isn't real. Nobody actually thinks that. Nobody would actually do that. And so when they joked about running down protesters with a car, we compiled a document and we brought it to our city and to our police, and we said, this is what they're going to do. They're going to come here and do this. And the city waited, and they said, well, there's nothing we can do. And then finally they took it to a court, and the judge said, these threats aren't real. And then that happened. A Nazi drove his car down a road 50 miles an hour into a group of peaceful protesters who were celebrating that the rally had ended, who were causing no violence, and who were walking on a street that was supposed to be closed. 30 people were hurt, including many of my friends, and 1 person died. That online rhetoric became real. Everything about online trolling became real. And I was right there. And that's me in that striped shirt and the blue backpack. And I talk about gun culture in the United States and the 6 militias that we had. My arm is like this because I had to be carrying a gun. Because all of the threats that were being made against our community were also being made against me personally. And for the weeks leading up to Unite the Right, and specifically in response to my comments about James Damore, I spent the week before receiving dozens of direct death threats a day. And I was 15 feet away when he attacked us. And had he come out of that car with a gun, I was the only person on site that could have stopped him. That's how real this has gotten. But what's interesting is this isn't just abstract. In the link between these things, there's actually a direct link. And if you haven't read the BuzzFeed story that came out 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, that talks about the links between Gamergate and journalists and people in politics, you should read it. Because there is a direct link between Gamergate, between LambdaConf, and between Unite the Right. All of these people are related. This was all part of one movement. This was all part of one design. Milo Yiannopoulos is connected with Steve Bannon and Curtis Yarvin, who's connected to Richard Spencer, who's connected to Jason Kessler. And so what happened in Charlottesville might have been news to you, but I have been living this for 3 years. This is very, very real. And as technologists, this is our space. We have the ability to control this. We have the power to stop this from happening. There's a little bit of good news that came out of this. Because for all of the grief that Steve Bannon has caused me personally over the past few years, it was Charlottesville that took him out of power. It was what we did that led to him leaving. And it's a hollow victory because so many people are hurt. 3 people are dead when you count the 2 state police troopers who died when their helicopter crashed on August 12th. But that's what it took. And every time I think about this, I just think about this. That as technologists, we have a duty not just to preserve democracy, but actually to fight white supremacy. Because we built the tools that make this possible. We work for the companies that give these people platforms. We design the integrations that make it easy for them. We are the data scientists who can design the algorithms. We are the UX designers that can build better tools for blocking and reporting and ending harassment. It needs to be our priority. And as was introduced, I guess along those lines, I will say that in a minor victory for this, I had to fly in late yesterday because I had to be in court. Because the organizer of Unite the Right, Jason Kessler, I managed to actually get him arrested for online harassment, which is such a rare... which is such a rare victory in this world because we don't have the tools, because it's so easy to hide. It is so easy to be anonymous. It is so easy to just bury ourselves in a Discord server or to use an alt Twitter account and to get away with it. And so he made a mistake. And now he's facing jail time possibly for it. But what else can we do? What else can we build to make this better for the people who are out there fighting? And if you're not out there fighting, this is my call to action. Whatever it is that you can do, whatever it is, and I'm not saying that you have to be out in the streets because that was horrible, but whatever you do, whatever your privilege is, whatever your platform is, whatever your skills are, please, please, please consider using them to fight this. And if nothing else, let's fix voting machines. Thank you.